Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is ugly. And this is in regard to our political climate and many things that are happening in the world. We get to be looking at ugliness and beauty and the opportunities that are presented in the face of ugliness. I was going to talk about beauty this morning, but what came up was ugly. So we get to talk about that too. Good morning, Rosalind. Welcome. So good to have you joining us this morning, and welcome to everybody else who is joining us. And it should be an interesting conversation. But before we get started, let's take a couple minutes to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, creating a brilliant beam of light from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together. Vigorously rub those hands together to feel all the sensations, the friction, the temperature, the motion, the pressure, the tickling and tingling when you stop, and allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So today we're going to talk about ugly. I looked up the definition of ugly, and two of the definitions, one of them had to do with morally reprehensible. That might be a bit extreme. I'm going to look it up again to share. Just give me 1 second. And ugly is very unattractive or unpleasant to look at, offensive to a sense of beauty, displeasing in appearance. That's our traditional awareness or use of the word ugly. But as we continue here, disagreeable, unpleasant, objectionable, morally revolting, threatening trouble or danger, mean, hostile, quarrelsome, unpleasant, or dangerous. And if we look at so much of what's happening in our world, I tend to want to focus on the beauty. And there's also quite a lot of ugliness that's happening politically talk about morally reprehensible. We see such incredibly ugly behavior on the parts of so many politicians right now. And even in the face of policy making, there's so much ugliness happening and divisiveness and separation. And in bringing up this topic, the intention is not to get lost in the ugliness, but to look at how we can bring healing, how we can transform that ugliness into potential and healing and hopefully beauty. And so or at least some degree of balance and neutrality. So the opportunity and the ugliness that we're experiencing is that it is hopefully at the very least awakening us to issues that need our attention, that need our care, that need our intention to transform situations, to transform thinking, to transform ways of being. And the point is that without bringing these things to awareness, they don't necessarily get addressed. They get to remain a part of the status quo. So we were talking about this yesterday when we were talking about heresy, and heresy being a challenge to the conventional thought. And unfortunately, in so many ways, our ugliness has become a convention in terms of the prejudices that become deeply entrenched in our culture without even any awareness that these prejudices are in fact prejudices and that they're not fact. So here's an example, and this is an example of unintended ugliness. But we see in our culture right now a rise of anti-Black and anti-Semitic prejudices. And I'm Jewish, and I was talking to a friend, and they were talking about how they were deciding not to spend money on themselves for something that was really important to their self-care. And they said, I'm just being a Jew about it. And I was just taken aback. I said, I'm Jewish, and I really take that's super offensive. Do you have any idea how offensive that is? And it's so interesting because my brother just recently recounted a similar situation that he had had with a friend. And although the friend that it was sort of not as close a friend. And it's just appalling to recognize that there was no malice intended by either of these people that spoke that prejudice with such ease. It just existed for them as a fact of life, not as a prejudice. It was just the way things are. And there's an ugliness to that, a deep, deep, deep ugliness to the prejudices that we hold without even recognizing them, without bringing them to any kind of conscious awareness. So there's not even a choice. It's a reflexive orientation, you know, that we have been indoctrinated to. And these sorts of prejudices exist on all kinds of levels. And we have prejudices about people who are poor. There are people that believe if you're poor, you're lazy, which is a really offensive prejudice. Really, I mean, like deeply ugly. There are people that believe if you're rich, you have no scruples. That's not necessarily true. There are rich people and poor people who are lazy and have no scruples. You know, the prejudices that we hold, the lenses that we see the world through, are colored in so many ways by indoctrination that is completely invisible to us. And that's why we need to recognize these uglinesses as recognize them and bring them to awareness so that we can actually bring choice to our perspective. So, when we are indoctrinated with prejudices about all different kinds of peoples, about institutions, and what happens is that we parrot these things and propagate these things without being conscious of how deeply ugly they are. These ideas, these beliefs, these cultural norms, for instance. So like this notion of Jewish people being cheap or corrupt or caring only about money, or like these are many of the prejudices. And right now, with this radical rise of anti-Semitism, it's scary, and it is happening hand in hand with the growing racial divides as well, and pitting peoples against peoples through all different kinds of prejudices it's something that we humans have done for centuries and centuries. But as we are hopefully awakening to a new level of awareness, a new level of humanity, what we're seeing is a rise in the ugliness. Hopefully it's rising so that we can heal it, but we need to be able to recognize it. We need to be able to recognize our unexamined prejudices and question them. We can't question them until we see them. So we have these prejudices against different ethnic groups. During COVID, people were horrible toward people who are Asian because they had this notion that COVID came from China, and that they wanted to have somebody to blame. And so anybody who was Asian, not just Chinese, was at risk of violence from crazy people who are just looking for scapegoats and people to blame for their circumstances. And this is a tactic and tool of regimes that are trying to assert supremacy, is by vilifying others and scapegoating others. And so if we blame someone if I blame you because I'm not as successful or well off or financially comfortable as I want to be, and then I'm first off abdicating responsibility and accountability for my own welfare, but also I'm creating a greater divide in the world. And what we need to be doing at this time is finding ways to unite with one another. We need to be finding ways to bridge these divides, to create a greater unity among us, to recognize that these differences are propagated and manufactured through a communicated culture of belief. It's not that there's truth. I mean, there are so many stereotypes, and yes, it's true that we can find people that fit a stereotype. But the thing about stereotypes is that they are skewed. They're very profoundly skewed. And we can interpret any circumstance in a multitude of ways. And we can recognize that there may be certain cultural patterns in groups, and we get to look at those patterns more deeply than the stereotype might lead us to look at those patterns. Like what's driving an actual pattern that might be perceived, and is that pattern being perceived through the lens of an existing prejudice to begin with? So there is such a profound call to awakening to our unexamined attitudes toward things. You know, we take it just as it is. We take it like it's just true, because that's what we've been taught. You know, we've been indoctrinated in all different ways. We've been indoctrinated through the media. We've been indoctrinated through religion. We've been indoctrinated through the culture of our individual families, of the history of our origins. And it's time for us to be challenging this indoctrination, to be, when we recognize the prejudice that we have, to be challenging that prejudice, to be looking at its source and its roots, and to be looking at what might be behind that pattern. Like, what is it that even identified that pattern to begin with? Like, where did that notion come from? Oftentimes the notions that belittle others are coming from a place of feeling threatened by the people doing the belittling. And it just gets, it's ugly upon ugly. And so rooting out the ugliness, bringing light to it, gives us an opportunity to address it and transform it and transmute it, and hopefully to heal it. And I think that we don't get to have the luxury, if we're looking to create an awakened world, we don't get to have the luxury of ignoring the ugly. It's calling to be addressed and healed. And that's where we can find possibility and potential. But as right now, as the ugliness is getting so much more voice to it in our culture, it is beholden to us to become more vigilant, more aware, more accountable to the unexamined thought that it's not even a thought, the unexamined ideas, the unexamined prejudices that create an undercurrent of our culture and of our being. So it's a challenge to bring the invisible visible, and especially to look at our own ugliness. I was my family was deeply prejudiced, and for me to recognize these unconscious conversations was a source of deep shame, actually, to recognize, oh my gosh, there's this noise going on in my head, these horrible prejudicial kinds of statements. It was like a soundtrack that was running in my head that I had no control over. It was like, oh my God, where did that come from? What a disgusting thought. What a horrible thought. Where did it come from? And it came from conversations in my family that I had grown up with, but they weren't mine. Like, I disowned them. I recognized that they were in my head, but they weren't in my heart. And in recognizing that these conversations were in my head, every time something, some kind of racial slur or something would just play in my head, it was appalling to me. And this happened for a long time until finally they've disappeared for the most part. Every now and then something shows up and I'm like, oh my God, where did that come from? Because it's not representative of who I am and how I be, or even how I think, but a patterned way of being in the world. And it's important that we expose these things to ourselves in order to be able to move beyond them, in order to be able to awaken and become the fullest expression of our highest being. That these accepted unconscious predispositions are not okay. It's not okay. And we need to recognize that. I can just say how, like, the degree of shame that I experienced within myself. This is not something that anybody else ever knew. But the degree of shame that I felt in hearing these tapes in my head, it was appalling. Rosalind says, love not able to be expressed results in anger. Oh, that's so interesting, Rosalind. I've not ever put those two things together, and I get that. And that's pretty spectacular. So things get very twisted. Things get very twisted, and it's beholden to us to root it out and to bring our awareness to it and to heal ourselves in that so that we can then heal the world. And becoming aware of the ugliness so that we can then maybe bring compassion and healing to that, bring understanding, bring in a new sense of unity and communion to that ugliness, to transform it. So by recognizing the ugliness, we have the opportunity to heal it. And that's really what we're all called to do now, as things seem to become more and more divisive, more and more separate, more and more oppositional. You know, this is a time that we can be setting a conscious gaze upon these circumstances in order that we can empower ourselves and others to transform them. So I think that's it for today. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I invite you to check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network and Enlightened World Living. And I just want to thank you so deeply for your willingness to engage in these tough conversations, sometimes tough conversations. And hopefully we can gain a new perspective and find ways to connect more deeply and authentically with one another as humans and with our planet and the other living creatures upon it. And so until next time, so much love to you.